We're coming off a wild week of fantasy football where we just see tons of studs being studs, as they usually are, and then we had some dud performances as well from some key guys. So this week, the rankings as far as wide receivers go, they're going to change up quite a bit here. You're going to see some new names on here, and you're going to see a lot of familiar faces in lower places right now because there's been some guys that we just have to reevaluate right now moving forward. So we're getting into the top 30 wide receiver rankings in week 5 fantasy football, and I just hit 5,000 subscribers on the channel, and I am giving away 5 FFN white hats this week to you guys. So go down there in the comments, drop your hottest take for week 5 fantasy football for a chance to win the FFN white hat right here, guys. And since I just hit 5,000 subscribers, I need your help to get to 6,000 subscribers. So please go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support for the channel. So let's go ahead and just dive into these rankings this week. So the first tier that we have up right now, it doesn't change one bit. Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson. Tyreek Hill taking on the Giants. I mean, Tyreek Hill is coming off a bad week in fantasy football. There's no question about that. Here's the thing about what just happened. The Buffalo Bills have a really, really good defense. This is defense that really shut down Tyreek Hill for the most part last week. He was open a total of like 3 times in that game. Tyreek Hill was blanketed versus the Bills. This isn't going to happen again. I mean, we're seeing them take on the New York Giants. This is a matchup that Tyreek Hill is going to eat up. He's going to take the Giants' lunch money this week. And then Justin Jefferson is here for the obvious reason. He's a great fantasy football player. I don't care what the matchup is. You can't guard Justin Jefferson either. Nobody is really shutting down Justin Jefferson this year, and I don't think it starts this week versus the Kansas City Chiefs. I just don't believe that anybody's going to shut Justin Jefferson down. Our next tier, we've got A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles taking on the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles this week. So several weeks back, which feels like ancient history at this point in fantasy football, I called A.J. Brown a buy low trade target. And lo and behold, after 2 bad weeks, he's been excellent in fantasy football all over again. He's scoring touchdowns again. The dude's wide open all the time. A.J. Brown's a beast. And A.J. Brown's going to continue to be a beast regardless of the matchup here. Now, there are going to be weeks where Devonte Smith has better weeks than A.J. Brown, but A.J. Brown is the best wide receiver in this offense still. And it's not a slight to Devonte Smith. That's just a testament to how good of a player A.J. Brown is. This week against the Rams, love the matchup here. I think that he's going to do great things. Number 4, Stephon Diggs taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars at home this week. Stephon Diggs just went off. I mean, you can see on the screen, he's averaging 19.9 fantasy points per game right now, and he scored 2 touchdowns last week against the Miami Dolphins. Stephon Diggs was unstoppable. Literally, and this is the thing with Stephon Diggs that I've been saying all offseason, which is that Stephon Diggs is a player that, regardless of the drama that, is attached to Stephon Diggs sometimes, this is a top-notch player in the NFL. And of course, when he's putting up numbers like that, it's easy for everybody to see, right? Stephon Diggs, I don't care what the matchup is. He's simply a lock in the top 5 every single week in fantasy football. Devonte Adams is the next receiver up here in the same tier, taking on the Green Bay Packers in Las Vegas this week. Listen, Devonte Adams, even though he had a down game last week, he still was excellent in fantasy football. Like, this is a guy who, I don't care what the quarterback situation is. Devonte Adams always will belong in the top 5. Because you saw it last week with Aiden O'Connell. It wasn't a great week for Devonte Adams, and especially of his standards, but he still dominates in target share, and he's still just a tremendous route runner. His separation skills are second to none, really, in the league. So Devonte Adams is going to continue to be a top 5 guy for me every single week. Again, regardless of matchup and regardless of who the quarterback is. Now, dropping down to tier, we've got Amon-Ra St. Brown versus the Carolina Panthers in Detroit this week. Amon-Ra St. Brown, what you'll notice here is that his fantasy points per game as compared to the guys in a tier above him and even some guys below him are, from a fantasy points per game perspective, he's nothing like tremendously special. He's not going to get you 19 fantasy points per game. He's never going to average 20 fantasy points per game. That's not really who Amon-Ra St. Brown is. Who he is very consistent, though. You can count on him. 8.75 targets per game and 6.5 receptions per game, and he's typically averaging around 80 to 90 reception yards. Amon-Ra St. Brown is seriously just as consistent as it gets, and every week he's going to be inside the top 10 unless something unforeseen happens. Against Carolina this week, it's a no-brainer. I mean, he's going to dominate the Carolina Panthers this week. I'm calling for that game right now. Cooper Kupp at number 7, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. The return of Cooper Kupp, I think, is happening this week. From what I have seen, Cooper Kupp is on the block right now to return in fantasy football. That's the return that I do believe is going to happen. Now, if he doesn't return, obviously Puka Nacua is going to shoot up in this list, because I do think that with the return of Cooper Kupp, I think Puka Nacua will be affected because Cooper Kupp's just a great player. But Cooper Kupp, if he plays, he's taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. It's not the greatest matchup for sure, but it is a situation right now that I just think Cooper Kupp is going to come back and he's immediately going to get 10 targets the first week that he's back. And if he comes back, he belongs inside the top 10. Right behind him is Puka Nacua. Same matchup, same team, obviously. Like I just said, I do think that with Cooper Kupp coming back, Puka Nacua will be affected to a point. How far does that point go, though? I don't think it goes that far. Puka Nacua has established himself in this offense. I mean, just take a look at the numbers on the screen that he's putting up right now. This is a guy who's averaging 13 targets per game and over 125 reception yards per game, and he's averaging 19 fantasy points per game in half PPR with just 1 receiving touchdown this year. Puka Nacua has totally established himself in this offense. So yes, while I do believe that Cooper Kupp will come back and be the wide receiver 1 in this offense, I don't think that Puka Nacua is all of a sudden just going to become irrelevant, though. I just don't see that happening. I think Puka Nacua is absolutely going to continue to be a top 12 fantasy wide receiver because he has established himself. I've got CeeDee Lamb taking on the San Francisco 49ers at number 9 in San Francisco. Listen, the matchup is not great on paper, right? Like, San Francisco's defense is not great on paper. Something that I talked about in my lessons learned after week 4 fantasy football was that San Francisco's defense, while they're great on paper, they're not always great defending the pass specifically. Their secondary is a little weak, and Marquise Hollywood-Brown, not a great week last week, but he did expose that defense a little bit for being a little bit soft in coverage. So I think that the run game is going to be largely stifled, and I think that Tony Pollard, you'll see his ranking reflected in tomorrow's video, but I think that CeeDee Lamb, for me, is going to be in a situation like it was last week, where he didn't have any big plays, but CeeDee Lamb was very, very good, and I think he's going to continue to get better as the season goes, and I think that this is a week where he's just going to be extremely important once again. Number 10, I've got Chris Olave getting back inside the top 10 after being way down in my rankings last week, and he's taking on the New England Patriots in New Orleans this week. So listen, I had Chris Olave lower ranked this past week, and I got a lot of flack for it, and I said, this is not rest of season rankings, this is weekly rankings. And at that time, I thought that Jameis Winston was going to be the quarterback that week. Well, obviously Derek Carr played, and he didn't look good at all because the guy's still hurt. And that's going to apply to this week as well. But what I think is just different about this matchup is that it's just so much better. New England's defense got absolutely trampled against the Dallas Cowboys. And not only that, 2 of their top defensive players are not now out for a long period of time. Christian Gonzalez, rookie corner, was being a stud this year. He's out right now. Matthew Judon, star pass rusher, he is also out. So I think that this New England defense is about to take a major step back with all those players, and I do think that Chris Olave is going to rebound from having a 1-catch week, and I think that he will get back to having like 6 or 7 or 8 catches this week in fantasy football. Nico Collins, back inside the top 12 against the Atlanta Falcons this week in Atlanta. Nico Collins, I said last week, was a buy low candidate. I had him in my buy low candidates video, and a lot of people were asking me, why is he here? Like, Tank Dell's the wide receiver 1. And I said, it's debatable. It's debatable. Now, I also will admit, I was big on Tank Dell last week as well, and I was a little bit lower on Nico Collins. But Nico Collins, I think, has established himself as a clear wide receiver 1 in fantasy football at this point. This guy, look at his numbers on the screen that you can see right now. 18 fantasy points per game, 8 targets per game, over 100 yards per game. This guy is doing so well with CJ Stroud, and CJ Stroud himself is humming right now. This is a clear, easy answer for me. Nico Collins absolutely belongs inside the top 11. So moving on to our next guy, Michael Pittman Jr., also coming off a bad week, just like Chris Olave. They are taking on the Tennessee Titans at home this week. So I say this every single week. The Tennessee Titans are not good at defending the pass. Now, they looked good against the Cincinnati Bengals last week, but their secondary is weak. So this is a matchup to be taken advantage of here, and Anthony Richardson just continues to look great. Now, 11 completions last week, that's nothing to be super excited about and jumping all over the place about. But Michael Pittman, I also called him a buy low trade target for this week because I'm bought in on the Indianapolis Colts. I'm so bought in. I think the matchup is great this week. I think Michael Pittman has a good rebound week for you this week. Number 13, Brandon Ayuk versus Dallas. Brandon Ayuk simply is just a tremendous fantasy football option this year. I mean, 17.5 fantasy points per game, over 100 yards per game average, and Deebo Samuel probably still going to be at least a little bit hurt coming into this game versus Dallas. He's probably not going to be 100%, and with the Dallas defense, it's obviously not a great matchup, but without Trayvon Diggs, the week that they got trounced against the Arizona Cardinals, Marquise Brown had a very, very good day in fantasy football. That defense is not the same, specifically in the secondary, without Trayvon Diggs. So I do think that will affect things here, and I don't think that the Brandon Ayuk matchup versus Dallas is as scary as a matchup as some people may think it is on paper. Number 14, I've got Jaylen Waddle taking on the New York Giants in Miami this week. So listen, this same thing applies to Jaylen Waddle as it did with Michael Pittman. Coming off another bad week, and really, Jaylen Waddle hasn't had a good week yet. I mean, you can see averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game and 5 targets a game. But here's the thing about the targets per game. Jaylen Waddle has never been a big target guy since his rookie year. Last year was the same thing. He was averaging roughly 5 targets per game last year as well. The difference between last year and this year is he was hitting touchdowns. He's still averaging plenty of yards per game. On 4 receptions, 70 yards per game. Like, this guy is still hitting big plays. And last week versus the Buffalo Bills, he scored a touchdown that got called back. So if he scored that touchdown, we're looking at Jaylen Waddle from a much different lens in fantasy football this week. I'm going to look at him in the same lens I would as if he scored that touchdown, because he did. And the call that got called back on was a bad call. That's aside the point. The point being, this is a great matchup here for Jaylen Waddle to get on track. Versus the Giants defense, I'll take this all day and I'll eat it all up. Devonte Smith at number 15 here, taking on the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles this week. So I discussed this on my Lessons Learned live stream after week 4 fantasy football. And I was talking about the Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers. And I said, listen, what we've seen this year and last year as well is that one week A.J. Brown's going to go off. And last week A.J. Brown went off in fantasy football. 2 touchdowns, over 35 fantasy points, depending on the scoring system you're going with. And then other weeks, Devonte Smith is going to have great weeks in fantasy. Devonte Smith's had 2 down weeks straight because A.J. Brown has feasted. Devonte Smith, simply put, while I do think A.J. Brown's a better player, you can never have Devonte Smith outside of like the top 20 to 15. That's usually the range that Devonte Smith is going to be in, unless he's on a hot streak, because Devonte Smith is still really important to this offense. 7.3 targets per game and over 70 yards per game in fantasy this year. So Devonte Smith, I get it. Some weeks it's not his week, but you continue to play Devonte Smith. Jamar Chase at number 16, taking on the Arizona Cardinals in Arizona this week. So Jamar Chase, he's taking a fall right now. And really, I'll be honest here, it really isn't even his doing, because he's still important. You can see he's averaging over 10 targets per game in this offense. But the problem is the efficiency. 7 receptions for 70 yards, and he's got no touchdowns yet this year. And I think the ultimate problem and why he's here right now is because not only do I not actually love the matchup, I actually think that, listen, Arizona, they're a tougher out than a lot of people thought coming into the season. But I think the other problem with Jamar Chase is that the offense right now is just simply not at their best. It's not even close to their best. Joe Burrow is really dealing with an injury right now, and I think it's going to continue to affect him. So Jamar Chase, you continue to have him in your lineup for sure, and I do think he can be a buy low trade target. depending on how low you can get him. But Jamar Chase is still going to be inside my top 20 because the target share is totally there. You can't have Jamar Chase outside the top 20 with 10 targets per game and the talent that he is. Deebo Samuel in that matchup versus Dallas this week in San Francisco. Listen, Deebo Samuel coming off a goose egg week. Didn't get a single touch, not a single thing that he did in fantasy football. And I also discussed this earlier this week as well, which is that Deebo Samuel is in a situation where he was coming off a rib injury that he suffered the previous Thursday night. And so in hindsight, it makes sense why he wasn't used in this game, because they figured we're going to win this game. And so we might as well just rest the guy when we need him for when we get to a Super Bowl contention area. Deebo Samuel, if he's not healthy, why would you play him? Because he's a stud. He's still a stud right now. And I still have lots of confidence in Deebo Samuel. I think that, like I said with Brandon Ayuk, the matchup is not as scary as it may seem on paper as well because of Trayvon Diggs' absence. They're definitely not as good on the back end as they are with him. So I think that Deebo Samuel will be fine. I would not make too much of a game where he doesn't have a single carry or target. Moving on to number 18, I've got Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars taking on the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo this week. So what you'll notice here is that Christian Kirk hopped above Calvin Ridley this week. And it's for good reason. He's been way more important in this offense the past several weeks. Christian Kirk is starting to dominate in target share. And it's so funny because after Calvin Ridley's touchdown that he had in London early in the game, we all thought that this was going to be a Calvin Ridley game. Christian Kirk is still important in this offense. And it really goes back to what I said in the preseason. Look at the contract they gave him. They gave him over $70 million, and over half of the value of that contract was guaranteed. This guy is not going to ride the pine, and he's not going to just drop out of this offense entirely. And it clearly hasn't dropped. 8.75 targets per game and 6 receptions per game. Now, he's not a super explosive player. Like, that's not Christian Kirk's DNA, but he's still important in an upper tier offense when they're clicking on all cylinders. Christian Kirk, to me, belongs above Calvin Ridley at this point in fantasy football. Number 19, we've got Romeodobs of the Green Bay Packers taking on the Las Vegas Raiders in Las Vegas this week. Romeodobs at this point, you can't have him outside your top 30 rankings right here. In fact, a lot of people are probably going to argue this is too low. And I would understand that argument. I mean, Romeodobs right now is looking really good in fantasy football. 12.6 fantasy points per game and 8.25 targets per game. Like, this guy is not dropping in importance. And in fact, with the return of Christian Watson last week, he had 13 targets in that game. He's not going away. Jordan Love really likes Romeodobs, and that's important here. Romeodobs at this point is honestly in really close to must-start territory, and if he's not a must-start for you, he's a very high-end flex option at this point right now. Adam Thielen at number 20, taking on the Detroit Lions in Detroit this week. So Adam Thielen to me is, again, very similar shocker to Romeodobs right now. Adam Thielen's in a situation where he's clearly the wide receiver 1 in Carolina, and he's doing much better than I thought he would in fantasy football. 14.2 fantasy points per game, over 8 targets per game. Like, there's no question that he's the wide receiver 1 in Carolina. The question is, how high is the upside on a weekly basis? Because there's going to be weeks where he really doesn't do much because they're going to get killed. And listen, I think it could be this week. Detroit is a tough matchup. Detroit is a really good football team. And defensively, they're very good as well. They just stifled the Green Bay Packers on Thursday night. I think this could be a tough week for Adam Thielen, but nonetheless, with this kind of volume, he's got to be inside the top 25 at least. Calvin Ridley taking on the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo, as I just talked about with Calvin Ridley. This is a guy who is so interesting to me because week 1 was great, and then ever since then, it's been bad. Like, it's been getting worse too. He's getting phased out of the offense a little bit. And I don't think they're doing it intentionally, but he's just, not getting open. He's not as open as much. So Calvin Ridley is a very interesting case study right now because, listen, he's still averaging 7 targets per game, but that number has dropped. And I still do think that he's worthy being inside the top 25 because he's still a big play threat. He still is a big play threat. He still can create separation. So I do like Calvin Ridley still, but I think it's time for us to address what's really going on with Calvin Ridley, and it's not a very good thing. And I think a lot of it has to do, as I said all offseason, with the fact that this guy was not playing since 2021. 22, I've got Christian Watson taking on the Las Vegas Raiders in Las Vegas this week. So Christian Watson to me is really hard to rank, to be honest with you, because Christian Watson only had 4 targets in this week 4 game, and he got a touchdown, so it saved his fantasy week. But other than that, like, if he didn't have that touchdown, you can see it on the screen, it would not have been a good week for Christian Watson. So I think that we just need to be careful with Christian Watson. The reason he's inside the top 30 right now is because, one, the matchup is good. The Las Vegas Raiders do present a good matchup for a wide receiver. And number 2, Christian Watson is also a big play threat. So he will get big plays for sure. I think that Romeodobs is the option that I prefer to start right now. Longer term, I think I still prefer Christian Watson because of upside. But right now, I will take Romeodobs over Christian Watson. Number 23, I've got DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears taking on the Washington Commanders in Washington this week. Listen, DJ Moore is, like, when he's on, he's on. And he had a great week last week. And a lot of that has to do with Justin Fields and how well he's playing as well. And listen, Denver's defense sucks, man. They just gave up 4 touchdowns to the Chicago Bears offense. You know you're bad when you're giving up that many touchdowns to the Chicago Bears offense. So I think that last week you can look at it and say, this is a really good week and we can build off of that. Don't go overboard with DJ Moore, though. This Bears offense is still not very good. And I think that with the target share that he gets, 6 targets per game, that's just not enough to sustain being able to be a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy. And while Washington is not a bad matchup, and I do think that Justin Fields could be in line for another big game, I don't want to tell you guys that we should be starting DJ Moore with full confidence yet. Marquise Hollywood Brown taking on the Cincinnati Bengals in Arizona this week at number 24. Marquise Brown is honestly a very reliable option right now, I think, at this point. Target share is totally there. 8 targets per game, and he's got 2 touchdowns this year. Now, the problem is that if he doesn't get the touchdowns, you can see here, reception yards per game, less than 60. So the upside is not that high from a big play perspective because this Arizona offense is just simply not that great offensively. They're not capable of explosive plays. But volume, he's got to be here. He's got to be here, and he's taking on a reeling Cincinnati Bengals team. So I'm good with Marquise Brown here in the top 25. And at number 25, I've got Zay Flowers taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers in Pittsburgh this week. Listen, I called Zay Flowers a buy low trade target last week. It didn't work out great for him in week 4. And I keep saying this every single week, and sometimes I catch flack for it, but sometimes I don't. The Pittsburgh Steelers are a great remedy for struggling players, either running backs or wide receivers. And Nico Collins had a great week on them last week. I think Zay Flowers could be in line. He's a low-key good option this week for me personally. I think that he could be in line for a pretty decent game this week. Target share is still there. 7.25 targets per game. Just needs to hit on a big play or a touchdown. And I think that it could come this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Jacoby Myers in that matchup versus Green Bay. This is contingent on if Jimmy Garoppolo returns. And by the way, I'm filming this on late Monday night, so I don't have a ton of injury news on Jimmy Garoppolo. But the last thing I read was that he's still in concussion protocol, which is a little bit concerning for his week 5 status. But if he plays, Jacoby Myers definitely has chemistry with Jimmy Garoppolo. And I think that he belongs inside the top 30 if Jimmy Garoppolo plays. 27, I've got Tank Dell for the Houston Texans taking on the Atlanta Falcons. So obviously, I discussed Tank Dell a ton last week. If you were watching my videos last week, you know that I was going off about Tank Dell and how he was going to be a great starter this week. Obviously, it was a Nico Collins week and not a Tank Dell week. They significantly shrunk those numbers that you see on the screen big time. He's averaging 12 fantasy points as a result, 6 targets per game. But this guy is still going to continue to be important in this offense. And it's so weird having 2 Houston Texan wide receivers inside my top 30, but I'm confident doing it. CJ Stroud has looked really good. Atlanta's matchup is not a bad one at all. It's really good, actually. So I think that having Tank Dell in here is going to continue to work on a week-to-week basis, depending on the matchup. 28, I've got Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos this week, taking on the New York Jets in Denver this week. Courtland Sutton is, I have to put him inside my top 30 at this point. It's a guy that if you were with me last year and you were watching my content last year, first of all, thank you for being here for this long. But the other part of it is that I was so big on Courtland Sutton last year that I got so burned on him. But I mean, I had to acknowledge what's happening right now. He's the wide receiver 1 in Denver right now. He's averaging 7 targets per game, and he's got 3 touchdowns through 4 weeks. This guy is legitimately being a good option for Russell Wilson right now. And I think that in a matchup like this against the Jets defense, which is not great, obviously, but it is a matchup that I think Denver could take advantage of because I think Denver is going to outscore the Jets this week. Garrett Wilson in the same matchup here is at 29. And listen, Garrett Wilson week to week is just going to be so unpredictable. But I think that the only reason he's really on here is because Denver is awful defensively. They're probably the worst defense in the league. Probably the worst defense in the league. And Zach Wilson is coming off the best game of his career. So maybe he can take that confidence into this week against a bad Denver Broncos defense. That's what I'm banking on here, and that's why Garrett Wilson is inside the top 30 rankings right here. As much as I would love to put him higher, can't do it because of quarterback limitations. Number 30, George Pickens rounding it out, taking on the Baltimore Ravens in Pittsburgh this week. Listen, bad week for George Pickens indeed, but I'll continue to say this, is that as long as he can get the targets, he's going to continue to be inside the top 30 because no Deontay Johnson. Now, obviously, last week, he didn't have many targets. I think that George Pickens is just simply such a great player that all he needs is like 6 or 7, to 10 targets for him to hit a big play. And I think he can do it this week against the Ravens. Even with Mitch Trubisky likely going to be in the lineup, unfortunately, it really doesn't change that much. And as we do every single week at the end of rankings, I'm giving you my favorite underdog sleeper wide receiver flex option of the week. And this week I've got Jahan Dawson of the Washington Commanders taking on the Chicago Bears. This is a juicy matchup to take advantage of. And we got a beacon of hope last week when he scored the game-tying touchdown to send the Commanders into overtime versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I think there's a little hope here for Jahan Dawson because they did that against the Philadelphia Eagles. And I think that they could do it again against the Chicago Bears this week. 4 catches for 27 yards. What he got last week, not impressive at all. But I do think that there is room here for Jahan Dawson to get better this week, especially against a Chicago Bears defense that is just absolutely tragically bad. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below and what questions you need answered before Week 5 fantasy football. And if you want to see some buy low trade targets before Week 5 fantasy football, click on this video right here.